Hello and welcome to episode 56 of Question and Answer, and I am your host, Panyo Bahasa. And because it's episode number 56, I was considering having on the thumbnail a picture of a 56 Chevy because it has a nostalgic value for me. When I was a teenager, it was like my dream car, or just maybe not so much a dream car, as I didn't actually dream about it, as just it was just like my favorite kind of car at the time, but I never got one, and probably just as well. And I'm feeling kind of low energy today. I think it's partly because of the weather, because it's just been kind of cloudy and dark and humid and warm and still, just windless out there. And I'm like a human barometer. I'm sensitive to climatic changes. So, um, nevertheless, the show must go on. So, with the help of the caffeine and this here sweet tea, I'm going to commence to answering questions. I'm fixing on starting to commence as I speak. So, the first question is from Bodhisattva 969. And Bodhisattva 969 says, how could you be more than 20 years a monk in Myanmar? Haven't you ever felt lonely and abandoned? Well, I mean, I'm a loner by nature. I mean, I can have a mate and that's fine, but um, yeah, I've generally tended to live alone whenever possible um, over the course of my life. And so living alone in a cave in a foreign country where nobody speaks English, it really was not that big of a deal to me. I've been sort of an introvert. My world is sort of internal. And especially as a monk, I tended to view what was going on the outside, including people interacting with me, largely as just sort of stimuli. And so, partly just because of my own personality quirks, I really did not feel lonely. I mean, there was a point around 2010, 2011, where I was burning out on Burma, but I'd lived in Burma for so long that my supporters in the West had pretty much just sort of gone their own ways, just sort of drifted away. I didn't really have access to internet or anything like that in those days. And so, I mean, communications were very spotty at best. And it just seemed like I was stuck in Burma. So I kind of felt abandoned in that respect, but it didn't make me feel sad so much as just kind of frustrated and just sort of stubbornly intent on getting back to America regardless. But yeah, I mean, loneliness is really not something that I experience much of. Boredom, it's like the most bored I ever was as a monk was generally when I was having to sit through a long sermon given by a Burmese Sayadaw, um, or just having to sit through long ceremonies that really I didn't have any interest in at the time. So generally, I'd be most bored when I was with people instead of like alone. So, yeah, I mean, it's just a personality thing, I guess. It's one of the reasons why I was able to be a monk for 30 years, is I just enjoy being alone. And for the most part, um, like human companionship, like friends coming over, that sort of thing. Um, it's sort of like the, it's like a person's duty to be a good host, to offer good hospitality and so forth. And, but I mean, if I had no friends, it probably wouldn't bother me all that much. So I guess I answered the question. I'll just move on to Bodhisattva 969's next question here, which is, was Ajahn Maha Boowa an arahant? Well, he was definitely considered to be an arahant by lots and lots of people in Thailand, especially, although there are people in northwestern Burma who have considered me to be an arahant. So just because people think you're an arahant, it doesn't necessarily mean all that much. I mean, this is sort of like a little slice of a bigger question that's farther down. So in a way, I'll be addressing this question when I address a later question also. But I mean, Ajahn Maha Boowa, I've never really known that much about him. I was more a Burmese Buddhist, I mean, I knew more about the Burmese Seatos, the famous ones, rather than the famous Thai Ajahns. Um, he was considered to be an Arahant. He was a disciple of Ajahn Mun, I'm pretty sure, who also was considered to be an Arahant. But Ajahn Maha Boowa's biography of Ajahn Mun is pretty strange. I mean, if Ajahn Maha Boowa was an Arahant, then Arahants can believe or at least endorse some pretty weird ideas. And some relatively heretical ideas, like Ajahn Mun being visited by this crowds of long dead Buddhas and their long dead Arahant disciples, just like coming to hang out with Ajahn Maha Boowa in his cabin at night. Just lots of stuff that it's a coin toss. And probably you're better off when you toss the coin to just like toss it up and it'll like land on the other side of a fence where you can't even see it. But I'll be getting to that a little later. So was Ajahn Maha Boowa an Arahant? That's my answer. It's just yeah, I think I'll probably be answering that question a little better in a little while, a little farther down here. So I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Maitreya Buddha. And Maitreya Buddha said, "Have you considered being a theology professor at a university?" Well, if I hadn't become a monk, there is a possibility, a real possibility, that I could have wound up being like an ecology professor or some sort of biology professor at a university, and probably an unemployed one at this point, because I'm just not politically correct. Especially if I was a biology professor, I would have even more reason not to refer to guys as she, for example. And then, I mean, you just lose your job regardless of tenure. I mean, if you offend somebody who's like that, then yeah, I mean, it'd be a matter of principle. So, I mean, most universities are like like Marxist snake pits at this point. And I use the term Marxist rather loosely to include like Frankfurt School type progressivism, the culture of critique and all that. So, so there is that. I mean, academia is just sort of like a leftist snake pit at this point, with few exceptions in the West. Also, I mean, a Buddhist wouldn't really be a theology professor, I'm pretty sure, since theology is like the study of God. Sort of a religion professor of Buddhist studies or something, but the whole academic attitude towards Buddhism is very different from the attitude I have had for the past several decades. So, yeah, I don't think I'd really fit in there very well. And also, as some commenter to this question on the YouTube video pointed out, I think you pretty much have to have at least a master's degree to be a theology professor pretty much anywhere. And I decided to become a monk rather than pursue my education. So, yeah, I've never seriously considered it for a variety of reasons. So, I think I'll just move on to the next question here. And this is from Hayet's Tig, and Hayet's Tig is kind of a wise guy. And so Hayet's Tig said, "What beers did you drink when you were a lad? Has your taste in beer changed over time? Do you prefer any brands or types of beer, such as stouts, red ales, IPAs, lagers, etc.?" So he's like trying to out me, I think. Just relying upon my own honesty to out myself. Because I do not keep 5 precepts perfectly, largely because I do drink the occasional alcoholic beverage. And so, what beers did I drink when I was a lad? Well, let's get into this. By golly. The unofficial beer of my graduating class in high school was Schlitz malt liquor, which has died. I don't think they even make it anymore. I think Schlitz got bought out by some other company, and then the whole thing just went belly up or something. I have not seen any kind of Schlitz since I stopped being a monk and started walking through grocery stores in the West again. When I was in college, I drank kind of a lot of Killian's Red Ale, which was good. And it was a little spendier than stuff like Schlitz, but it was worth it because I really liked the taste of it. Um, if I was on a budget and wanted to just get drunk cheap, there was this stuff called Old English 800, which came in these like 40-ounce torpedoes, and just one of those would get you pretty drunk. Beer was a lot weaker in those days, so Old English 800 was like 6%, and that was considered really strong. Like the average beer was like less than 4% back in those days. I've noticed that beer has gotten stronger since I came back and started drinking beer again. And then let's see, Bass Pale Ale. I think I used to say that if God drank beer, he drank Bass Pale Ale, even though technically beer and ale are different. But I haven't even seen that on the market. I'm sure they still make it in England. They just don't import much of it into America anymore. So of all the beers that I used to drink and enjoy when I was a lad, as Hayes Tig says, Killian's Red Ale is the only one that I can still find. And there's just one place in town where I can be relatively sure of finding it there. I've noticed it at Walmart a few times, but usually they don't have any there. So yeah, I drank 2 of them last night, and that's about my limit for the most part. I usually don't drink more than about 2 beers, which means I usually don't drink enough to actually feel any effects. I just like drinking something that isn't sweet and isn't water. And in the evening, drinking coffee is not such a good idea because then I can't sleep at night. So let's see. Do you prefer any brands or types of beers such as stouts, red ales, IPAs, lagers, etc.? I generally prefer malty beer to hoppy beer. So, like Killian's Red Ale is good. Um, Gosh, yeah, sort of like the darker, the more alier kind of stuff, and the less skunky stuff. I do drink IPAs occasionally. Excuse me. Obviously, need more sweet tea. IPAs, they tend to have sort of like the hoppy bite to it that something like Killian's doesn't have. But I'm open-minded. I can drink just about anything so long as it doesn't taste like vinegar. I drank some Belgian copper ale once. When I was in college, there was this place down the road called Bully's that had beers of the world. And if you bought a beer, you got this little card. And if you bought every beer that was on the card, you got a free shirt. And so in order to get the free shirt, I drank this Belgian copper ale. It tasted pretty much like vinegar. I don't know if it was supposed to taste that way or else nobody ordered it and it was just turning into vinegar on the shelf or something. I don't know. But of the beer that I enjoyed when I was young, that I still drink occasionally, is Killian's Red, which is good. It's good beer. It's not extremely expensive either. So I'll just move on to the next question. And this is from the Spanish Inquisition. And the Spanish Inquisition says, for a couple of years you have answered all these questions from us viewers, but if you were to ask us 1 or 2 questions, the same 1 or 2 questions for all your viewers over the years to answer, what would it be? Well, that's kind of a good question. I mean, what would I ask my questioners or my viewers? And I guess the big one for me would be, if Mr. Spock from Star Trek and Kwai Chang Caine from Kung Fu got in a fight, who would win? I mean, it's like the Vulcan, or he's half Vulcan technically, but he counts as a Vulcan. He's supposed to have about twice the physical strength of a human being. Plus, he's really intelligent, so he'd be good at strategizing and so forth. Plus, he's got like the Vulcan nerve pinch. But Kwai Chang Caine, I mean, he's like a black belt in Kung Fu. And he's also got like the spiritual, he's just kind of in the moment and everything. So, I mean, you could say that if Kwai Chang didn't know about the nerve pinch and Spock was able to get him by the shoulder, then Spock would win. But it's hard to say, really. So, I mean, if anyone knows definitively who would win, if they've actually watched the fight, yeah, I would like to know who would win between Spock and Kwai Chang Caine. There is one other question that haunted me for many years, and now it's just academic because it doesn't really apply anymore. But it used to be that they made light brown plain M&Ms, but not light brown peanut M&Ms. And I used to wonder about that. I had this my own theory that it was like a combination of like like the Coriolis effect and something else, but I don't know. But it doesn't really matter now. I don't even care what the answer is now. But questions to ask viewers. Yeah, that would be it, I guess. So I'll just move on to the Spanish Inquisition's next question. I wonder if the Buddha would be pro or against vasectomy. What do you think? Well, I mean, he was calling the shots with regard to the Sangha of ordained renunciants. And I mean, a vasectomy would just be redundant. I mean, if you're celibate, you don't need a vasectomy anyway. With regard to lay people, I think the Buddha really wouldn't care all that much. I don't think he'd really adopt a position pro or against vasectomy. But who knows? Yeah, I mean, Buddhism is really just geared towards, at least it was, geared towards celibate renunciants. And like it has very little to say about marriage and childbearing and so forth. You know, like I said, I think it was the last Q&A that it's a very serious offense for a monk even to participate in a wedding ceremony. Because, and so in a Buddhist country like Burma, you don't go to the monastery, you don't go to a priest or anything like that to get married. You just go to the village headman and sign some papers. And then afterwards you have like a reception where monks can be invited and so forth, where they will bless a done deal, essentially. But with regard to vasectomy, yeah, I really don't think he would care all that much one way or the other. Unless there was some sort of, you know, ancient Indian cultural thing. But vasectomies weren't an ancient Indian cultural thing, so I think I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from Siyovaxsh En-sipad-zid-ana. And Siyovaxsh En-sipad-zid-ana says, in a previous Q&A, you said that from a non-materialist perspective, being unconscious can be explained by time being a perception as well memories. And when you are unconscious, you simply don't have temporal perception or memories of it. Does that mean you are in Nibbana while unconscious and don't remember, or is this layer of unconsciousness even more deep than Nibbana due to having no memory active or time perception active? Although I heard that Nibbana can't be an object of memory either, so I don't know. Well, first I would just say that you're not in Nibbana. I mean, nobody is in Nibbana unless everybody's in Nibbana, regardless of how wise or foolish they are, just because Nibbana is reality. So, yeah, so if you're unconscious, it doesn't mean that you're in Nibbana. I mean, Nibbana is always there, but you, I mean, there's no you. I mean, subjectively, there's no you to be anywhere if you're completely unconscious. This is not talking about sleep, because when you're asleep, you're not completely unconscious. Otherwise, nobody would be able to wake you up. You know, I mean, in order to be woken up from a sound sleep, you have to be able to hear people or the alarm. You have to hear something or feel yourself being shaken or whatever. So being completely unconscious would be more like being in a coma or being in some deep, you know, anesthesia. And even some anesthesia, apparently you're not completely unconscious, especially if they don't administer the right amount or something. So, let's see. I need to read this question again. Can be see, unconscious. Being unconscious can be explained by time being a perception as well as memories. And when you are unconscious, you simply don't have temporal perception or memories of it. Yeah, that's I endorse that. Does that mean you were in Nibbana while unconscious? No, because I mean you're not anywhere subjectively because I mean you are like a mental construct that has broken down while you're unconscious. It's just not there. And is this layer of unconsciousness even more deep than Nibbana? Nothing is more deep than Nibbana because Nibbana is reality. It's like absolute ultimate reality. And all this phenomenal stuff, including people in hospitals being under anesthesia and so forth, is part of the dream that may rely on the ultimate reality of Nibbana for its existence, because you can't have just a pure like a pure illusion. The illusion has to be based on something. So I'm not sure if I answered this question to his satisfaction, but yeah, it doesn't mean that anyone who's unconscious is enlightened. Although, I mean, I think there are probably some Mahayana Buddhists who would say something like that, because they would say that trees and rocks are enlightened too, because they're just pervaded with ultimate reality and there's no ego or anything like that obstructing it. Because that's the main thing that prevents us from being enlightened, is just all this distracting symbols that we pay attention to that and take it seriously and believe it, and just kind of ignore the reality that it's resting upon, so to speak. Let's see here. So I guess I answered that question. So I'll just move on to Siyovaxsh En-sipad-zid-ana's next question here. What did you think when you first heard the Twin Towers were attacked while you were a monk thousands of miles away who renounced the world? Well, I did remember when I first heard about the Twin Towers, like 9/11, 2001. I was living in a cave in central Burma, and these two Burmese guys came to visit me. And one of them was going to tell me something, and then the other one said, "Oh, don't tell him. He might get sad or depressed or something." And then I guess between the three of us, I don't remember how it happened, but they wound up telling me anyway that some rich Arab crashed a plane into the World Trade Center. And I mean, that was all they said, really. This rich Arab crashed a plane into the World Trade Center. And I was thinking, well, maybe, I mean, a Cessna was loaded with explosives and he used remote control or something. Or, I mean, I didn't have a clear idea about it, except for gradually, as time went by, I kept hearing more and more, and then asked my mother to send me some newspaper clippings, because they still had like newspapers in those days. And so she sent me an equal number of news clippings about 9/11 and about the local high school being burned down, because when something little that's close up appears as big as something big that's far away, kind of a deal, I think. So what did I think when I first heard the Twin Towers were attacked? I was guessing maybe some rich Arab just crashed a Cessna loaded with explosives using remote control or something. And I really didn't know what to think until gradually I got more and more information. So I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from White Ash Piper. And White Ash Piper says, during your stay in Burma, did you witness the conflict between Muslims and Burmese? Well, I mean, I wasn't present during any race riots or anything like that. The closest I came was I think I was staying at a monastery called Chaltsindoya, which was maybe 15 miles away from the city of Meitila. And at the time when I was at Chaltsindoya in Meitila, I'm pretty sure it was Meitila, there was one of these, it was like a riot that happened. And the story is that this Burmese Buddhist woman tried to sell a gold hair comb to a Muslim, like a shop owner, a guy who would be like buying gold and silver and jewelry and stuff and then reselling it or whatever. And she was asking for a certain price for this gold hair comb. And he wouldn't give her the price, but then he broke it like accidentally, and he just wouldn't pay her what she wanted. So they started having a fight, and there was a Burmese man with her, I think, and it turned into like a shoving match, and then he got pushed down, and then like the Muslims kind of got together and they're like fighting back, and so you had this little brawl going on. And then the Burmese Buddhists left, and they're sort of rabble rousing, and somehow a monk came with them. I don't know if he was going to try and be a peacemaker or what, but he went and he said he wanted to talk with these Muslim guys. They agreed, and then they took him aside. And according to the story I heard, I was told this by a monk who knew more about the story than I did at the time. He said they cut his neck, which means either they cut his throat or they just cut his head all the way off or some such, which then, I mean, when Burmese people I mean, there's such devout Buddhists. If Muslims are going to start attacking or killing monks, then yeah, I mean, all bets are off. You're going to have shit hitting the fan big time. Probably even more so than when a Burmese Buddhist girl allegedly gets raped by Muslims, which that happened a lot too. At least the allegation happened a lot. So that was the closest. I mean, I was within about 15 miles of it happening and heard about it maybe a few weeks later when I moved to a different monastery where the monk was well informed about the whole Buddhist versus Muslim thing going on. But I didn't actually witness anything other than, newspapers and so forth. So I think I'll just move on to the next question here after having another sip of sweet tea. And this is from Judge Caligula Bushman. And Judge Caligula Bushman says, what's your opinion of Julius Evola's Doctrine of Awakening? You did a review of the book and had some criticism of the sources he used. Well, Julius Evola was kind of a hard right, like an Italian fascist who was at least an acquaintance with Mussolini, gradually soured on Italian fascism because he thought it wasn't spiritual enough. And then he moved to Nazi Germany because he thought German National Socialism was more spiritual. He wrote a lot of fascistic stuff. He wrote a lot of like sex magic stuff that is still taken seriously, even in some New Age circles. And also he wrote at least one book about Buddhism called The Doctrine of Awakening. And at the time, I mean, I don't remember exactly when he wrote it, back in the 20s and 30s, I think, early 40s at the latest. He was writing a book about Buddhism, and he was trying to portray it as the best spiritual system for the Aryan aristocrat living in the West. I mean, with regard to the masses, he really didn't care what the common person was following. It didn't really matter. Let them be Christians or whatever, it doesn't matter. But like the aristocracy, the people that really mattered, the people that were so high up that they were, they had access to like spiritual powers as well as earthly powers, or heavenly powers. It's like his idea was that the highest level of being a human is you're the conduit of the gods or the higher spiritual powers to the rest of the world, and so you have a greater responsibility to be benevolent and wise and so forth. So he was trying to use Buddhism as a way of demonstrating. I mean, it's kind of nice. I read it when I was a monk, and he was trying to portray the enlightened Buddhist arahant as sort of like the Nietzschean Superman, which, I mean, is kind of interesting. But for the most part, his book, it was intelligently written. It was well written. The Evola was definitely an intelligent person. But it was very similar to the sort of Buddhist literature written by Westerners from like the early to mid 20th century, where they have limited sources. Like Julius Evola, he had a few Italian translations. I'm pretty sure he didn't know hardly any Pali. He didn't read from the original Pali sources. So he relied upon sort of pioneering works, early translations of Pali texts into Italian and maybe into English also. Especially the Majjhima Nikaya, I think, was one of his main sources. And it's the sort of stuff that, it's well written and everything, but it's there's a limit to it about how deep it can go, because he really wasn't living the life. He wasn't really practicing Dhamma intensively, although when he was a young man, I think right after World War I, he was like somewhat suicidal, and then he read a book about Buddhism which inspired him and according to him gave him a reason to live. And whether he considered himself a Buddhist or not, I don't know, but he definitely had respect for Buddhism and advocated Buddhism as a kind of religion or spiritual movement for the aristocratic Aryan elite. But and if you read it, I mean, you get an interesting take, like an unusual but still, reasonable take on Theravada Buddhism as it would apply to the modern West, which is good. I mean, you learn a lot about Buddhism, especially if you don't know a whole lot about Buddhism, but you should definitely read other sources to get, sort of a triangulation, different points of view on the same subject, which is very good for just about anything. But with regard to Buddhism, it is good to get a variety of points of view. And yeah, it does remind me a lot of the earlier stuff, like written by the contributors to the Polytext Society, for example, where, I mean, they're definitely interested in the material, but they had like this intellectual academic way of trying to explain it. And just because of the approach to the material, it really didn't get very deep. But with regard to like a superficial overview, plus, as I say, that the perspective of like Buddhism as kind of like like a spiritual system for a fascistic master race or something, it's interesting. So I think I'll just move on to the next question here. And this is from Saint Sword. And Saint Sword says, what's the graduation rate of Theravada Buddhism? I mean this as in, how many fully enlightened arahants have you met? Well, the easy answer to that is, it's hard to tell. But he has more question here. It says, and please don't brush off this question by saying it's hard to tell. It's not hard to tell. I've met at least 2 in my lifetime, and you can look into their eyes and tell that no one is back there. If it's hard to tell, then that just suggests the number is 0, which is fine. I rather hear 0 as it's an honest assessment. I don't know. If the spirituality industry were honest, this seems like it would be a really important question. And then he further adds, I don't ask it out of maliciousness. I ask it as a concerned consumer losing his mind with this stuff. I have a constant pendulum swing from there's something to all of this in the midst of the bullshit to this is all bullshit and there's no help for an honest seeker that has 0 tolerances for bullshit. So this is a deep question. And I doubt if Saint Sword is going to be very satisfied with my answer. But just for starters, well, no, even before just for starters, he says he's met at least 2 enlightened beings in his lifetime, and you can look into their eyes and tell that no one is back there. Well, you can't tell if someone else is enlightened unless you yourself are enlightened. That's one thing. I mean, you can be sure someone's enlightened, and there's a lot of those in Burma. Like I was saying, there's a lot of people that consider me to be fully enlightened. They just, no doubt, they just know it. You can even tell them that you're not enlightened, and they'll get like this really uncomfortable look on their face, but then they'll just justify you saying that, as, and just continue believing it. And so, I mean, there's lots of people considered to be enlightened. But here's what I was going to say for starters. That for several episodes, I've just been pounding away at the idea that Nirvana is off the scale. That Nirvana, it's invalid to say that it exists, invalid to say that it doesn't exist, invalid to say that it does and doesn't exist, invalid to say that it neither does nor does not exist. There's nothing you can say about it that is ultimately valid. So, if Nirvana itself is like that, what do you say about a person who has attained Nirvana? I think you would say an arahant. I mean, you can't say that an arahant exists. You can't say that an arahant doesn't exist. You can't say that an arahant does and doesn't exist. You can't say that an arahant neither does nor does not exist. In fact, there's one sutta, at least one sutta, where the Buddha is saying that with regard to whether an enlightened being exists or not after death, I mean, you can't even say whether they exist or not while they're alive. Also, this reminds me of some texts by a group of Buddhist logicians. It's called the Dignaga school, or sometimes it's called the Yogacara logicians. Whether they were really of the Yogacara lineage or not, I don't know. It's Mahayana Buddhism, I guess. And their classic example of a problematic premise, that as a statement that cannot be proven one way or the other, is that a person is enlightened, or even that enlightened beings exist, because there's no way of proving it. So, let's see. I should just read this question again here. What's the graduation rate of Theravada Buddhism? I mean this as in, how many fully enlightened arahants have you met? Well, I'll just answer that question. How many fully enlightened arahants have I met? I honestly do not know. I honestly don't know. Maybe like Shui Umin Seattle. I've met him. He was very impressive. But whether he was an arahant or not, I don't know. And that also reminds me of a statement by Ram Dass, where he's saying that someone can go halfway around the world and try to find an enlightened guru in the Himalaya mountains, when the whole time back at home, Aunt Mabel has been fully enlightened. Except instead of like telling him the secrets of the universe, she just says, have some soup. But as it turns out, have some soup is the perfect thing to say under the circumstances. So let's see here. Let's see. If it's hard to tell, then that just suggests the number is 0. Not exactly, because as I was trying to say, it's like if Nibbana is off the scale and you can't say whether it exists or not, enlightened beings who have attained Nibbana are off the scale and you can't say whether they exist or not. It's like the famous verse from the Sutta Nipata, just as a flame blown out by force of wind, comes to its cessation and no longer subjects itself to any designation, even so the sage who has freed himself from the mass of names goes to its cessation and no longer subjects himself to any designation. So I'm saying that the more cynical a person is, then the less openness towards the paradox or the miracle or whatever you want to call this enlightenment, which is just off the scale. And again, you can't say whether it exists or doesn't exist, or does and doesn't, or neither does nor doesn't. So it's just like this, it's like this paradox, this seeming miracle, this inexplicable whatever. And if you're just completely closed off to that, then yeah, the chances are essentially 0, barring some miracle. Like I've mentioned Ren Lewis, who was kind of the smug scientific materialist type. He was the leader of a group of atheists for a while. Then he had a near-death experience, just purely accidentally. And it was like a spiritually enlightening near-death experience. And then he became like Eckhart Tolle. And whether he was claiming to be enlightened or not, I don't know. But he was claiming that, he was definitely permanently, or, as a result of the near-death experience, in this higher level of consciousness where he is aware of essentially, infinity, or I don't want to misrepresent him. I don't remember exactly what it was that he was always had access to. It was a higher level of consciousness. So, setting aside somebody like that, it's like the most unenlightened people in the world, in certain sense, are like the smug scientific atheists who think, it's all bullshit. And they would just fight tooth and nail against any evidence, or else just kind of smugly, shrug it off or whatever. And then it's like, as you practice spiritually, it's like the openness to the very possibility of the impossible miracle gets wider and wider. And seriously, I think that from a samsaric context, enlightenment is just meaningless. It's just off the scale. It doesn't mean anything. Practically, from a samsaric definition or samsaric point of view, enlightenment is just like bullshit. It's just impossible. So, it's like, who is considered to be fully enlightened? Ajahn Maha Boowa, who wrote this really bizarre biography of Ajahn Mun, and I really don't know all the details. Eckhart Tolle is considered to be enlightened, and he's married, but I don't know of any like real scandals. I haven't seen him acting in a blatantly unenlightened manner. You got Jed McKenna, who was brought up by Saint Sword himself, who at the very least is a liar and extremely smug. I mean, in his books, he's talking about how he lives in this certain place, and he's got these disciples that live there with him, and that place just doesn't exist. There's no pictures of Jed McKenna. There's no interviews on the internet of Jed McKenna. At least when I looked several years ago, there was nothing. I haven't been searching for Jed McKenna lately. And he's just like an egomaniac. He just brags and brags and brags about how enlightened he is. And then, so, I mean, Saint Sword seems to consider Jed McKenna to be, sort of kind of a heavy hitter. At least he seems that to do that. And really, I mean, Jed McKenna is just a complete question mark to me. You got Osho. I mean, I've read Osho's books. I've heard some of his talks, and I've read some of the scandal stuff about Osho, and I mean, he seemed more glib than wise. I mean, he definitely had some charisma, like the penetrating eyes and everything. And I mean, he had to have attained something. And I've met a few of his disciples. I asked him, "You think Osho was enlightened?" And at least one of them, he just, of course he was enlightened. It was just plainly obvious. And the other one that I talked to, he was kind of non-committal. He wouldn't say he was or he wasn't. But, I mean, people that are considered to be enlightened, I mean, if we had detailed information on the life of Gautama Buddha, then I'm sure there's stuff that you could come up with saying, yeah, see, look what he did. Or, sort of like in the New Testament, Jesus is supposed to be the perfect man, but, he's like crying and like attacking the money changers at the temple and driving out the people selling livestock for sacrifices, and like a what was it, some knotted cord or something he's using as a whip, and he's hanging out with tax collectors and prostitutes and so forth. And I mean, you can find fault with anybody. J. Krishnamurti, he's considered to be an enlightened being, but he was messing around with his private secretary's wife for years. So, I mean, it's like whether a fully enlightened being, I mean, within a samsaric context, whether it even means anything is questionable. But it's like the wiser a person gets, the more access or the more open they are to this miracle. So, it's like you can start calling somebody enlightened, and it might kind of stick a little bit, but really, I'm not at all sure that an arahant can just objectively exist, regardless of what people are certain of and all this. Like Neem Karoli Baba up there is another good example. Ram Dass said, the better you got to know him, the more you realize there was just nobody there. He was just like a mirror reflecting your own karma back at you. But, I mean, his behavior was, going with orthodox traditions, it certainly was not completely enlightened in all times. He'd be yelling in anger and crying and laughing and like literally punching people and just all kinds of things. And, Theravada Buddhism says, an enlightened being wouldn't behave that way. So the whole thing is just this mind-bending conundrum. And I really think that the more spiritually advanced you are, the more open you are to the possibility, which means you've got less of a closed door to this like inconceivable, miraculous paradox. And that's not much of a question, but then again, we're dealing with something that is off the scale. If nirvana is off the scale, then people who have attained nirvana, that very attainment is off the scale. And again, you can't say whether it exists or doesn't exist or does and doesn't or neither does nor doesn't. It's just off the scale. And then you can't nail it down. Well, did this person attain what is off the scale? It's like, it doesn't work that way. So I'm just saying, the wiser a person gets, the more advanced they get, the more open they are to ultimate reality, or the possibility of ultimate reality, or the possibility of people like attributing enlightenment to them and it seeming plausible. But I wouldn't be surprised if there has ever been an enlightened being, other than maybe Ramana Maharshi, who was just a pure 100% pristine saint and sage. But even Ramana Maharshi, I mean, if you're like a cynic, you can make fun of him. I mean, he worshipped a hill, Arunachala. He wrote devotional hymns to this hill. His best friend was a cow. You know, there's all kinds. I mean, you can just find fault with anybody. If you've got like a cynical, sort of a spiritually closed mind, then yeah, I mean, you just got a shell around yourself. But the more open you are, then, I mean, eventually, like, again, the Platform Sutra of Huineng says, you know, if you become enlightened, you look around, you see everyone else is enlightened also. So it's just not so much a matter of whether other people are enlightened, it's just how much of a veil are you behind? How much of a shell do you have around you? And then whether it's like a critical mass or something. It's like once the veil gets thin enough, then, you know, you can start saying maybe that person's enlightened or something. But I think different people would have different like thicknesses of shell that they can still get away with. Sort of like in Theravada, there is a tradition, and you can find in the text, that fourth jhana is like the jumping off point to enlightenment. But then again, there's also descriptions of monks that didn't have any jhana at all that still became enlightened. So it's like that the amount of purity that you have to cultivate in your mind. I mean, some people need a lot of purity in order to get to this nebulous, miraculous, indescribable state. Others, it can just happen to them, like John Ren Lewis or Eckhart Tolle or even Ramana Maharshi, who just became enlightened, supposedly, allegedly, according to his own testimony, as the result of a panic attack he had as a high school student. So, yeah, I mean, it's like wanting to pin someone down with a concrete, objective yes or no question about something that is completely off the scale, completely ambivalent, just defying any kind of logic. It's just paradoxical and miraculous. It just doesn't work that way. So I think Saint Sword might be just as much in the dark with regard to my answer as before I started. But I mean, if you can't say whether Nirvana exists or not, you can't say whether people who have attained Nirvana exist or not. And within the samsaric context, it would sort of, the answer would be leaning even toward no. That within samsara there is no Nibbana. And thus within samsara there are no arahants. But you can get closer and closer. I mean, as you detach from samsara, you know, you're holding samsara with a looser and looser grip, then, you know, these miraculous possibilities become more possible. But with regard to actual numbers, there are no actual numbers. So I think I'm just going to move on to the next question here. That was an important one, though. So this next one is from Rui. And Rui says, simple one, Panyo. Thank you, Rui. Simple one, Panyo. Was there anyone who was present at all the Buddha's sermons? And then he says, do you think bhikkhus were authorized to recite sutras to one another during the life of the Buddha? And then he says, did the whole retinue of bhikkhus move together with the Buddha, or did some groups remain at certain locations? And then he says 3.5 questions. Sorry about that. Well, was there anyone who was present at all the Buddha sermons? The Buddha himself was present at all of them, but nobody else was. Nobody else was present at all of the Buddha sermons. And see, do you think bhikkhus were authorized to recite sutras to one another during the life of the Buddha? I don't think there'd even be an authorization involved. You know, you wouldn't have to be checked out on, you know, authorized, certified. You know, they wouldn't have a certificate or something. It's like, let's say the Buddha gave a discourse to a group of monks, and then some newcomer monk comes in from somewhere else, and I don't think there'd be anything at all against one of the monks who heard the discourse telling the other monk what the Buddha was saying at the discourse that the other monk missed. I don't, or just, yeah, I'm sure that it would be encouraged that if you heard something from the Buddha, you should share it with other people that hadn't heard that. And did the whole retinue of bhikkhus move together with the Buddha, or did some groups remain at certain locations? This, my answer to this will sort of be my answer to, was there anyone who was present at all the Buddha's sermons? It's like once one of the Buddha's disciples, I mean, according to tradition, according to the suttas and so forth, once he became enlightened, he didn't need the Buddha anymore. You know, it's like the Buddha's part of the raft. You know, you use the raft to cross the flood. Once you get to the other side, you don't need the raft anymore. So the way it says in the text, the Buddha, I mean, once his disciples got enlightened, he'd encourage them to go off and get their own disciples and you know, spread the word. You know, it was a more efficient and effective way of spreading Dhamma rather than having just all focused on this one guy, because I mean, the Buddha did not have any monopoly on legitimate, genuine Dhamma. So he would teach his disciples until they were qualified to teach themselves, and then off they'd go and they'd teach also. And even before they were enlightened, you can see clearly enough in the suttas that the Buddha would encourage monks to just go off alone into the forest, go alone like the horn of the rhinoceros, to sit at the root of a tree and meditate. And so there was a lot of emphasis on just your own reliance on yourself and solitude as a way of cultivating emptiness. And of course, once somebody became enlightened, they really didn't need to hang out with the Buddha anymore. They were, in a sense, a Buddha themselves. Buddha just means awakened. So, let's see, did I answer all these questions here? Was there anyone who was present at all the Buddha's sermons? Somebody might say, oh, what about Ananda, who was his attendant? But Ananda wasn't his first attendant, and wasn't his attendant until later on in the Buddha's life. He did have attendants before Ananda. So, yeah, I mean, I seriously doubt there was any monk who even attended most of the Buddha's sermons. And with regard to the bhikkhus being authorized to recite sutras to one another, yeah, I'm sure it was encouraged, so long as, you know, they got their facts straight. And did the whole retinue of bhikkhus move together with the Buddha? No. It's like once, I mean, the ones that he ordained might accept him as their preceptor until he saw fit to, you know, tell them that they're on their own. They should just go off and do something else. I'm sure a lot of monks came to see him. You know, they wanted to see the master. You know, there are stories of, like, I think it's Sona Kurikana, maybe, who he was ordained under one of the Buddha's enlightened disciples in like a relatively southern province. And he'd heard about the Buddha, but he hadn't seen him, and so he wanted to go and meet the Buddha after, yeah, I don't even think he was enlightened yet. I can't remember if he was enlightened or not. But I'm sure it happened a lot. But I'm sure also the Buddha really did not want, you know, thousands and thousands of monks around, especially because they were beggars. And so they were going to have to not be too much of a burden on the surrounding householders. But Neem Karoli Baba up there, he was a guru, possibly enlightened, if that even means anything. And he'd continually be sending off his disciples, go on this tour of temples in southern India, or go and listen to Krishnamurti, who he called Ramamurti. And I mean, he'd always be like sending them away because there was just too much of an accumulation of disciples, just sort of making a crowd scene. So he'd be like dispersing them a lot. And I assume the Buddha did the same kind of thing. So I think I'll just move on to the next question here. And this is from Titus de Acenthis. And Titus de Acenthis says, can a Buddha have bad breath? And I was going to look this up just to make sure that I remember correctly, and I forgot to look it up. So in reality, let's say objective reality, can a Buddha have bad breath? I don't see why not. At the very least, like morning breath. I don't think that there's any cosmic law preventing an enlightened being from having gum disease or something, especially as they get older. But there is a list, I think it's the 80 lesser marks of the Mahapurisa, of the great man. You've got the well-known 32 marks of a great being. And then there's the lesser known 80 marks, 80 lesser marks of the great being. And I think one of those is like a sweet breath. But those marks of the great being are a later development. They really cannot be 100% objectively true simply because some of them are in conflict with others. Like one person could not have all 32 marks of a great man at the same time. So traditionally, I think the answer would be no, a Buddha cannot have bad breath. But personally, I think there is the possibility, at the very least, he could have morning breath or something like that. Or maybe he ate garlic, you know. So I'll just move on to Titus Diasynthes's next question. What is my opinion of Rasputin? Well, I really don't know a whole lot about Rasputin. He was like a heretical Greek Orthodox priest, I think. He was starets, which is a word I was unfamiliar with until I read the Brothers Karamazov, because Father Zosima in the novel is a starets. It's sort of like an Orthodox Christian guru. And apparently he was heretical in the sense that he was sort of like the Brethren of the Free Spirit, where they had this idea that to be forgiven your sins is a great miracle. And so the more sins you've got to be forgiven, the greater and more glorious the miracle is. And so this might not be true, but I have read or heard that Rasputin did engage in like orgies, like sexual orgies and so forth, as sort of like the spirit of God just sort of permeating everybody, and there's no more good or evil, and everyone's just going for it. And if they did do anything wrong, then they're forgiven, and then that is more glory for God or whatever. But I think the thing that's mainly known about Rasputin, aside from the movie Hellboy, we don't need to worry about that, is he had like a hypnotic effect on the wife of the Tsar, the last Tsar of Russia, and he had a calming effect on the boy, their son, who was heir to be the Tsar if he hadn't been murdered by the Bolsheviks. And he had hemophilia, and so he had like painful internal bleeding and so forth. And Rasputin had like this hypnotic effect on the boy that could calm him down and alleviate the pain to some degree, which caused the mother and to some degree the father, the Tsar, also to have this like emotional dependency on Rasputin. And maybe he was also giving political advice that presumably he was, because he was eventually executed or assassinated, and he was very hard to kill. I mean, they poisoned him, and that wasn't working. Then they shot him, I think. They stabbed him several times, and they threw him into a river, and then he didn't drown. He was still alive. They found him washed up on the riverbank farther down, and then they finally managed to kill him, according to the legend. So really, I mean, he was just another, in a way, kind of like an Osho figure, maybe. But I don't know enough about him, especially with regard to his spiritual attainments, if any, what he was able to do or not do. But I do not have a secret name for my generative organ, but if I did, it would probably be Rasputin. So I'm just going to move on to the next question here. And this is from Yuga-u. And Yuga-u asked the interesting question: can you tell me if ignorance is intentional or unintentional? And it depends on what kind of ignorance it is. Like if it's ignorance of Spanish, well, I mean, you can, let's say you had the opportunity to study Spanish in school and you decided to go for French instead, then your ignorance of Spanish would be intentional because you freely chose not to study it. So that kind of ignorance, you have the opportunity to learn something and you deliberately turn it down, then yeah, that would be a kind of deliberate ignorance. But ignorance in like the metaphysical or ethical or spiritual sense of like moha, loba dosa moha, greed, hate, delusion, as it generally goes, or avidya, which is like spiritual ignorance, then it's not really intentional because you can't really be aware of it. To the extent that you are aware of your moha, it's not moha anymore. So with regard to being mindful, you can be mindful of like attraction or lobha. You can be mindful of aversion or dosa, but you can't really be mindful of moha, which is delusion or ignorance, because to the extent that you're aware of it, you're not deluded or ignorant to that same extent. So you can be mindful of the first two, lobha and dosa, but to be mindful of moha is practically impossible. So that's something you always have to be careful about, because you don't know how delusional you are. Nobody does. I mean, nobody knows how delusional they themselves are. They might know how delusional you are to some degree. Not that I'm picking on Yuga here. So that is a good point, though, because it's something that should be brought up, that you really can't know how much moha or avijja you've got in like a spiritual sense, because you just practically by definition you cannot be aware of it. If you were aware of it, then it wouldn't be moha anymore. So with regard to the question, can you tell me if ignorance is intentional or unintentional? Then yes or no, depending on what kind of ignorance it is. And I mean, even some spiritual ignorance, I mean, it can be intentional in the fact that, you have the choice to, live a spiritual life or just follow along in your father's footsteps of being a pimp or something, and you just go the other route. I mean, in a way that would be intentional, but I mean, actually having delusion or avijja, I mean, you can't be aware of it at the time. I mean, in retrospect, you can think, boy, I was really foolish then. But while it's happening, to the extent you're aware of it, then you've kind of transmuted it into wisdom. Like one of my favorite verses from the Dhammapada is, the fool who is aware of his own foolishness is at least wise to that extent. But the fool who considers himself wise is called a fool indeed. So being aware of your own foolishness is actually wisdom. Go figure. So Yugu's next question is, lately I burden my mind with organized religion. Being raised in one, I really cannot let go of having resentment for it. How do I deal with it? Thank you. Well, I think it was the very, very last Q&A before this one where I'm talking about any kind of like problematic, troublesome mental state. The panacea in Buddhism is just be mindful of it, just observe it. And by observing it, you're observing resentment. It's no longer I am resentful, it's resentment is arising. You are the one who's observing the resentment. If you are anything at all, you're not the thing that's being observed. So by being mindful of the resentment, just observing it, realizing it's just this mental state that's arising through force of habit, karma, that is not you, that it might not be particularly wise. It's just this habitual emotional thing that's coming up, and you can just watch it. And if you make a regular practice of that, then you weaken it. You stop reinforcing it, but you're not wallowing in it anymore. You're just kind of keeping it at arm's length, keeping this philosophical detachment between you and it, so to speak. So that would be just the standard Buddhist way of going about it. And I mean, it's not all bad that an organized religion, that you were brought up in an organized religion, because it got you where you are today. And you are apparently seeking Dhamma. You're trying to understand the truth, trying to cultivate some wisdom. So it's not all bad. There's some people that just say all religion is just attempts at like controlling the masses and so forth. And it's just like it's like this doctrine for them. It's like this law. They can't snap out of it, that all religion is bad. It's the worst thing in the world. More suffering has been caused by organized religion than anything else. And they're just, in a way, they're like these materialistic atheists who are like the most foolish of people, in that they're just completely closed off to anything higher than that. You talk about like the Roman Catholic Church, and a lot of people think it's just evil. It's just a bunch of pedophiles, just a bunch of gay priests molesting boys, and they don't see anything beyond that. They don't see anything beyond just, the most scandalous, the lowest, creepiest, most foolish level. And there have been like really advanced Catholic saints. Saint John of the Cross, I mean, he might have been fully enlightened, assuming that enlightenment even means anything. So, and he considered his teacher, Saint Teresa of Avila, also to have reached the stage of perfection. So, I think I'll just move on to the next question here. I hope I answered that one though. And this is from Keep the Vinaya. And I think this was a vegan skeptic. I think he changed his name to Keep the Vinaya. And so he very kindly asked only 6 questions this time. So that's good. I mean, not that it was bad that he asked more than 6 last time, but once I requested that you don't ask more than 6 questions per video, he was on the ball. He has what it takes. And so Keep the Vinaya says, don't you think it's pathetic to live an ascetic life just to hope to screw some girls later in heaven? This completely contradicts the idea of ending suffering by stopping desiring things. Shouldn't a monk do what he does because he has realized how delusional and primitive worldly pleasures are? Well, this is, I think this is probably a result of a video I did recently with Brian Rue. And Brian wanted to do some clickbaity video about sex in heaven and how finding out how like really nice, even orgiastically pleasurable some Buddhist heaven realms are, that it might encourage people to strive along a Buddhist path in order to get up to those celestial nymphs. But I did point out that, I mean, even though the Buddha himself used this, according to tradition, that he actually lured his half-brother Nanda, not Ananda, but just Nanda, on his wedding day. He showed him visions of what the celestial nymphs look like in heaven, and comparing that to, the woman he was going to marry, this mere human mortal woman. She looked like a monkey compared to these celestial nymphs in heaven. And Nanda must have been like a horny boy. So that was enough to persuade him, plus, anything else, the Buddha's own charisma and so forth. It persuaded him not to get married. He jilted his bride on his wedding day, jilted his fiancée, and was ordained as a monk. But then, see, the thing is, so Nanda was ordained because he wanted those celestial nymphs in heaven. But as he practiced correctly, his wisdom improved, and then he started seeing that samsara is not something to be striving for, you should just let go of all that. And so he did, and he became enlightened. He became one of the Buddha's enlightened disciples, according to tradition. Again, assuming that a fully enlightened being even means anything within a samsaric context. So, yeah, it's like you can use crude motivations to get you started in Dhamma. And then if you're practicing Dhamma correctly, your wisdom will improve, and so your motivations will improve. It's just as your wisdom increases, the wisdom of your motives also increase, and so you can move away from that. So it can be like what the Mahayana Buddhists call skillful means, where you're just getting someone on the path in whatever way that it takes, and then after they get on the path, then they're going to make progress, and then they're just going to outgrow their original foolish reasons. A lot of people, it's not just sex with celestial nymphs. A lot of people want psychic powers. They're practicing meditation because they want to be able to levitate and read minds and all this kind of stuff. And again, if they're doing it wisely, then their motives become wiser. If they're practicing correctly, they're meditating correctly and everything, then gradually, they just see the folly of all that and they just let it all go. So, yeah. But celestial nymphs in heaven, it's an infinite universe, so I guess they must be up there. for those of you who are into that sort of thing. So I'll just move on to keep the Vinya's next question here. Would it be best for parents to send their child to a monastery when he is a little older so that it does not come into contact with this corrupt world? Well, it sounds good. It doesn't always work that way. I mean, if you're sending kids that have no spiritual inclinations to a monastery, then it's going to be like a prison for them. They're not going to like it. It's going to be like the beings that wind up in this high heaven realm when the material universe is destroyed, and they're up in this very advanced heaven realm that's above the material world, and they can't stand it. It's just so boring. They're bored stiff. And I remember this story. I mean, I was involved in this. I was at this big school monastery in the city of Amarapura next to Mandalay. And there was this nun, and she had a son before she became a nun. She became a nun, and so she just sent her little kid, who was like 5 years old, to a monastery. She was just determined he was going to grow up and be a monk. This little kid, he was called a pothudo. He was too young even to be a novice. And so he was dressed in white. He had his head shaved, and he would handle the money because even novices aren't supposed to handle money. And so he was sort of like one of the attendants to the monks, and he just wanted to be a little kid. I mean, he was not there because he wanted to be there. He was there because his religious mama sent him there. And one day, one of the Siyados, one of the senior monks, gave him some money and had him go or told him to get some money and get some rubber bands. I mean, Burmese monks are always telling the attendants what to do with money, which is the same as the monk handling himself. That's a different issue. So, I mean, the monk wasn't entirely within the rules by telling this kid to go and buy rubber bands. But the kid took the money, and instead of buying the rubber bands, he went to see a movie. He wanted to see a movie. So he went to see the movie. He spent all the money on seeing the movie, plus whatever it is, popped rice or whatever that Burmese people eat at movies. And then he was afraid to come back because he figured he'd get punished. So he went and lived under a bridge with these homeless people, and they took his clothes and sold them, and he was just wearing these rags. And one of my teachers was responsible for this kid, and so every day he's out scouring the city of Amarapura looking for this little kid. Finally, after a number of weeks, he finds him at this tea shop. It was like one of the hobos gave him a little bit of money to go and buy some cigars for him at a tea shop. And the lady that worked at the tea shop had pity on him. And so she let him stay at the tea shop, and he was like, helping to clear tables or whatever. So the kid finally got brought back, and the story goes that he was sent to his nun mama, and the mother superior of the nunnery just like tied him to a post and just whipped him mercilessly because of all the trouble he had caused. But I mean, sending someone into a spiritual environment, if they're just not spiritually motivated to be there, is not the best thing you can do. So let's see here. Would it be best for parents to send their child to a monastery when he is a little older so that it does not come into contact with this corrupt world? Why not just keep him at home and teach him the way you see fit? And if you're living in some sin city with gangs and so forth around, just move out into the country, move into a conservative small town or something where it won't be so bad. But if the kid does have some spiritual yearnings or something, then maybe. But yeah, even like Catholic schools. When I was I was growing up in Aberdeen, Washington, and it was all public schools except for there's this one St. Mary's Catholic school, which went up to 8th grade. And then once they graduated from the 8th grade, they'd come over to the public, the junior high and the high school. And I mean, they had a reputation for being just the most hardened juvenile delinquents, which I think is somewhat similar to what I've just been talking about, where you put a kid into this religious setting and the kid just does not have religious inclinations. He's just a normie. He just wants to be a kid. Like trying to force them to be this way, they'll just rebel and push back the other way. I think my sweetheart was like that to some degree when she was in a Catholic school as a teenager. So I think I'll just move on to Keep Davinia's next question here. And it says, Is it allowed to buy a monk robe as a layperson so I can meditate with it at home so I'm already used to it if I will be a monk? Well, there's no rules against buying monks' robes or making monks' robes. If you want them made according to Vinaya, you'd probably have to make them yourself and wearing them, but you can't pass yourself off as a monk. If you wear the robes, shave your head, and then like try to blend in with other monks and don't tell them that you're not a monk, that's wearing the robes by theft, and then you are forbidden from being ordained for the rest of your life. In a way, it's sort of like a pre-parajika. And I think some of the bhikkhunis nowadays should be careful about that sort of thing. But we needn't wallow in that issue. So let's see here. Yeah, I mean, you can wear a monk's robe at home. I've worn my monk robe, my upper robe, at least once or twice since I disrobed, just to show how it's done. So, I mean, it's not like there's any kind of spiritual law against wearing monk's robes if you're not a monk. In the Buddhist time, everybody wore that kind of robe. It's just that they mostly wore white ones that were all in one piece instead of brown ones that had been cut up or sewn together or just made of rags that were sewn together. So, yeah, you can put on monk's robes just to get used to wearing monk's robes if you want to, so long as you're not trying to pass yourself off as an ordained monk if you're not one. So I'll just move on to keep the Vinay's next question here. Is it obligatory for a monk to answer a layperson's question about the Dharma? No, he doesn't have to answer questions if he doesn't want to. He does sort of have a duty to answer people's questions about Dharma, especially on Uposatha Day, the full moon day, the half moon days, the new moon day. He does have somewhat of a responsibility for guiding lay people that come to him in good faith. But, I mean, if they're not respectful of Dhamma, he's not only not under an obligation to answer their questions, but he's actually forbidden to answer their questions if they're just being, they're being sarcastic and disrespectful, asking these leading, sarcastic, cynical kind of questions, or it could be some soldier who's got a gun in his hands asking questions. You tell him, take your shoes off, take your hat off, put the gun down, and I'll answer your questions. You show respect for Dhamma, then I'll share Dhamma. So yeah, I mean, it's not any kind of rule some monks, they just avoid people. They just live out in the woods. And there is a sutta, I think it's the Greater Discourse on Voidness in the Majjhima Nikaya, where it does say that a monk, the only thing he should say to lay people is just politely asking them to go away if they come to him, when he's in the forest or whatever. So it's not required, although some suttas do indicate that you do have kind of a responsibility to guide the lay people, because you're the one who's cultivating the wisdom. You should share the wisdom to some degree, not so much that you're just being harassed with visitors all the time. You do have to emphasize, solitary practice and quiet, peace, meditation. But so it's good to answer questions if you can, but not so much so that you don't have time for serious Dhamma practice. And again, if they're being disrespectful to Dhamma or to you as the representative of it, then you shouldn't answer their questions. You should tell them, act in a more respectful manner, and then I can answer your questions. So I'll just move on to keep the Vinay's next question here. Is a monk allowed to wear socks inside of a monastery? Technically, a monk is not allowed to wear socks, period. A monk is not allowed to wear layman's clothing. So he's allowed to wear 3 robes, and really that's in the belt to hold the lower robe on. And that's really the technical, strictly speaking, that is it. I don't know if they've got special monk socks. I know they've got special monk vests and so forth. There's a thing called an anthagite, and they wear them a lot in Thailand too. I don't know what the name is for them in Thailand, but it's like a vest. Some of them only have like one shoulder. It's like a sort of like a tank top with only one strap that you can wear under your robe. And a lot of monks, if they're doing work outside, like raking leaves or something, they'll just wear that and not bother wearing the upper robe. But it was so hot, I'd just go bare-chested inside the monastery. Let's see here. But is a monk allowed to wear socks inside of a monastery? Technically, a monk is not allowed to wear socks. If he's living in like Denmark or Canada, where it's like well below freezing in the wintertime, yeah, it might be a good idea for him to take the hit just so that he doesn't get frostbite toes and start losing toes. So I think I'll just move on to keep winning his next question here. Would it be against the Dhamma if the Burmese stopped the Islamization of their country by not harming the Muslims physically, like, for example, by destroying their mosques at night when they are empty? Well, I mean, destroying a mosque at night when it's empty, it's not killing anybody, but you're destroying somebody else's property, which is pretty much like stealing. You are depriving them of their property deliberately. So yeah, that's burning mosques is also not a good Buddhist ethical way of minimizing Islam. So let's see. Yeah, I mean, the Burmese could stop or try to stop the Islamization of their country. Islamization. By not harming the Muslims physically. Yeah, I mean, that's what they should do. And there's different ways of going about it. I remember that same monk that was telling me about the riot in Metila, where the Muslims cut the monk's neck. He was actually involved in. There was a Muslim school that was started up just like a block from our monastery, and it turned out that they didn't have the permits and everything. They just went ahead and built it. And so he and this other monk actually reported this place and had it shut down just because they opened it illegally. So I mean, that kind of thing, or just informing the people, not rabble rousing, not like spreading hate or anything like that, but just educating the people and advising them to do some peaceful non-cooperation or some such. Yeah, that's about all you could really do as a Buddhist, I think. That and send metta. So I think I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Austin. And Austin says, the mind is so fascinating how it can twist your inner dialogue into a nightmare, and yet even with me knowing this, knowing the conditioned existence of it all, I still can't seem to put my depression aside. Any tips? Thank you. Yeah, depression is a difficult one. I mean, I've got depression like genetically from both sides of the family. But I've got people on both sides of my family that were prone to chronic depression, including my mother and including my father's father. So I do have some experience with that. I have undergone some considerable bouts of depression in my life. None real recently lately, which is good. It's like recently you can just feel yourself being sort of contracted or expanded. My mind does kind of expand and contract, but the more mindfulness you practice, the more you can see the early warning signs, so to speak, and do something about it. But I know for a fact, it's like if you're depressed and your mind is contracted, your meditation sucks worse than any other time. The more expanded you are, the easier meditation is. And you can be mindful of mental states more easily, mindful of anything more easily. But when you get into this contracted state of depression, then just trying to concentrate is like trying to balance a marble on the tip of a sharpened pencil. It just doesn't work. And so the time when you need it the most might be the time when it's most difficult to be mindful. So, I mean, I do have certain things like in the past, if I'd start feeling depressed, just sleep a little more and always accomplish something positive every day. It doesn't have to be anything important. You can just be like cleaning your room, washing the dishes, just do something constructive and positive every day. And just keep reminding yourself that, it's not me. It's like a contracted mental state. And just be aware you're in a contracted or depressed mental state, and don't take the thoughts that arise too seriously. I mean, you should never take them fully seriously anyway, just because they're not you. They're just mental states arising through the force of karma or whatever. So, yeah, just be mindful to the best you can. Maybe sleep a little extra if you can, and always accomplish something positive that day. And try your best not to take it out on anybody else. If you're in a bad mood, it's like when I'm in a bad mood, I just try to like mind my own business. I become quiet. I don't want to like vent on anybody else or take it out on anybody else. But aside from that, I mean, to the extent that you could be mindful of it, it's like in the Mahasatipatthana Sutta, it does say that, when your mind is expanded, it's expanded. When your mind is contracted, it's contracted. And that's mindfulness. Even if you know that you're not being very mindful, that's still mindfulness. It's sort of like what I was saying earlier, to the extent that you know that you have delusion, to that same extent, it's not delusion anymore. It might still be illusion, but so, I mean, yeah, I do feel for you, and I hope that your depression lifts. And when your depression does lift and you're able to practice better, then that's the time to do it. Because sometimes when you need it the most, it's the times when you can't do it. So it's good to be like in the habit so that you've got like this armor to protect you. And I was really depressed. Once as a junior monk, I was just, and then once I'd been a monk for about 10 years. And that was like the last really bad depression that I went through that I can remember. So good luck to you, sir. And I'll move on to the next question. This is from SS. And SS says, I almost said SS stands for, but it's like somebody's initials. It's nothing nazi. So SS says, regarding that part where Panyo says that the Hindu Buddhist heavens are like celestial versions of Indian palaces in Shakyamuni's time, one view would be to claim that these realms don't exist, that they're products of their culture projecting their values into the afterlife. Another would be to say that they exist, aren't exactly like that, but were so described to Indians as a skillful means. Another still, that they exist, are exactly like that, and even non-Indian converts will wind up in a very Indian-coded heaven after they die. Some would find it odd that people living on a different planet in a different kalpa, for instance, would be reborn in a heaven resembling Iron Age India, or a heavenly Jerusalem, or any earthbound culturally specific heaven for that matter. A fourth, I think, possible view would be the heavens exist but don't have a definite form. They are rather constructed by the collective karma of the aspirants and resemble that to which they aspire to. Thus, Indian heaven would appear Indian, etc. They are real places as far as real goes in samsara to those born there, not solipsistic dreams. Their form is stable, cannot be changed at will like a lucid dream, as the devas delighting in their creations might be able to do in their own realms, and exist for a very long time. I think Swedenborg has a similar account. It's all speculation, but we're talking about sex in heaven after all. Anyway, what do you think? So this was a comment under my sex in heaven video, which was that clickbaity one I did with Brian, because he wanted to do a clickbaity one with like titties and stuff in it, I guess. So yeah, I think SS is onto something here. Like, one view would be that claim that these realms don't exist at all, that they're products of their culture projecting their values onto the afterlife. Yeah, I wouldn't endorse that one. That's what the cynical materialists would endorse, I suppose, or members of other religions who say only our heaven is the real heaven. They might say something like that. So another would be to say that they exist, aren't exactly like that, but were so described to Indians as a skillful means. Yeah, I think there is some truth to that one. That, I mean, you can say that there are heaven realms. There are realms or modes of existence higher than the human mode or the human level. I mean, that shouldn't be too hard to swallow, considering the universe is infinite. Not just the astronomical universe, but, the universe which contains all astronomical universes and everything else. So, yeah, there's going to be an infinite number of higher levels than ours. So, let's see. Another still, they exist are exactly like that, and even non-Indian converts will wind up in a very Indian-coded heaven after they die. Yeah, I don't think so. So, and then the fourth, which SS thinks is possible, would be the heavens exist but don't have a definite form. They are rather constructed by the collective karma of the aspirants and resemble that to which they aspire to. Thus, Indian heaven would appear Indian, etc. They are real places as far as real goes in samsara to those born there, etc. Yeah, I think that's possible too. I think 2 and 4 here are both valid and correct to a large degree. So yeah, I think it's sort of like near-death experiences. You have a near-death experience where there's sort of like the stereotype where you find you're almost dead. You're drowning. You've been in a motorcycle accident. You're on a hospital table under being operated on, whatever it is, and then you realize that you're floating up above the body, your own body. You're looking down, seeing the body lying there, and then you just float up. You might spend some time looking around and noticing things that you can then recount when you come back. And then you go up towards this bright light, and then you go through the light, and then when you go through the light, you find yourself in like this heaven realm with a guide there. And the guide, if not an old friend or relative, is going to be some religious figure from your own religion. And you're generally going to see it's going to be like a dream world where it's like your own expectations are being projected into this world. And I think heaven realms can be that way too. Any realm, even our realm, it's like there could be all sorts of different possible realms at this level, where you have the same, level of consciousness approximately as a human. And there's lots of variation even among individual humans. So because of our karmic predisposition, we were just born into this particular version, but it's no more necessarily materialistic than the heaven realms are, if that means anything. So, yeah, I think I'm inclined to agree with numbers 2 and 4. That number 2 is they exist. Is that okay? Another would be to say they exist, aren't exactly like that, but were so described to Indians as a skillful means. And I think to some degree that's true. It's like in Burmese pictures of the Buddhist heavens, the gods and goddesses are wearing essentially the outfits of the royal courts of like royal Burma, like back when there were kings and queens of Burma. They'd be dressed like prime ministers and so forth. They'd be wearing these curly Q epaulets on there and these weird, it's like the gods would be wearing like these pagoda shaped hats, and the goddesses would be wearing something that was kind of like a Flash Gordon helmet. And, they just got these long flowing gowns and so forth that, yeah, that's just a cultural interpretation superimposed upon a heaven realm. And then his number 4 here is, that the heavens exist but don't have a definite form. They're rather constructed by the collective karma of the aspirants and resemble that to which they aspire to. Yeah, so even if you do have this culturally conditioned expectation, I think heaven is still going to be different from that. Partly because the culturally conditioned expectation is like sort of a crude, normie human expectation. And when you're no longer a crude, normie human, your point of view is going to be more expansive. It's going to be very different. So, yeah, 2 and 4. So I'll just move on to the next question here, which is the last question of them all. The last one. And this is from Zen Blues. And Zen Blues says, weird that I had a dream that I died and was just floating around the earth plane, thinking and meeting other ghosts. I have had a series of nightmares about a violent incident occurring in the house I live in, and the dream came true last week, though the violence never came to pass. Luckily, any ideas of what is going on seems like we have premonitions during the deep dream states. Yeah, it's possible you can have premonitions during deep dream states. It may be that most of them are the dreams that you don't even remember when you get up the next morning, but it's there. It's like you have access to deeper levels of consciousness when you're asleep. You may have certain access to psychic powers when you're asleep, but it's like this really like a latent level. And so you might have like precognitive dreams when you're sound asleep, and for the most part you won't remember them, and unless maybe they appear later as like a deja vu or something. Um, it could be. I mean, he says that he kept having these nightmares about a violent incident occurring in the house, and then the dream came true, although the violence never came to pass. It could be that he was sort of that Zen Blues here was sort of processing. I mean, it was first of all there'd be like the precognition of this big bad thing that was that was liable to happen, and then in a way he was sort of like processing it, working through it in the dream state until finally he was able to resolve it sufficiently that it didn't do its worst. It sort of mollified it. What's the term? Where you make it less bad. So I think that's possible. I think that kind of thing can really happen. I was going to say something else, and now I can't remember what it was. See, a series of nightmares about a violent incident occurring in the house I live in, and the dream came true last week, though the violence never came to pass. Yeah, I was going to say something else. I can't remember what it was. But yeah, I do think. Oh yeah, I remember now. Ram Dass. Somebody asked Ram Dass once. Should we take dreams seriously? It's like in ancient times, for example, people believed that gods would implant dreams. There's like the god of dreams, Morpheus, I think is who it was, and he'd implant dreams into your mind. Because they were like divine messages. But I think biologically, the main purpose of dreams is just to like organize information that you've acquired. A lot of them just seem like spam dreams that don't necessarily mean anything. I mean, a lot of them are just like absurd. And I think most of my dreams are along those lines, or you're sort of acting out like hopes and fears, stuff that's on your mind. You're thinking about it at night and spinning it into these narratives. But I do think that like precognitive dreams, even though I can't remember having woken up with a precognitive dream, remembering one, and then knowing what was going to happen in the future because of it, or expecting it to happen, that's never happened to me that I'm aware of. But I do think that it can and does happen. And it may be that having the series of nightmares about the violent incident, and then the incident happens, except it's not as bad as in the nightmares. I do think it could have been some sort of processing where you're working through the events in some karmic way that then, I still can't remember the word I'm trying to come up with, to mollify, to make it, to attenuate the seriousness of it. It's giving you an attempt to deal with it before it happens, so that when it does happen, like your karma is modified, and it's just not necessary for the worst to happen anymore. I do think that is possible. And so that was the last question. And so if you have any questions and you think I might be able to answer them, especially if they're about Buddhism or meditation or monks or just me personally, Western philosophy, Eastern philosophy, that sort of thing, religion in general, I tend to be fairly well versed in. If you think I can answer the question, feel free to ask in the comments below. If you have access to the Discord server, you can ask them there. If you have access to the Subscribe channel, you can ask them there. If you do have questions, I advise you to ask them under a Q&A video, and rather than under some other video, because I might forget to look under some other video. I always look under the Q&A videos because that's the main place. That and the Discord server are the main two places for finding the questions. So if you do have questions, ask them, in under a Q&A or in the Q&A room of the Discord server, or you can message me on the Subscribe, that sort of thing. And like and subscribe if you haven't already. Look at the URL links below the video, and be happy.